In a world where respect is earned through action, not words, sometimes the most unexpected person delivers the most powerful lesson. What happens when arrogance meets discipline, when mockery faces mastery, and when a single moment changes everything? This is the story of how one woman's quiet strength spoke louder than a crowd's roar, proving that true warriors don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear patience, until patience runs out. The gymnasium at Fort Braxton Community Center buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. It was Memorial Day weekend, and the annual charity event brought together military families, veterans, and civilians in a celebration that honored fallen heroes while raising funds for wounded warrior programs. The massive space, normally used for high school basketball games, had been transformed into something special. Red, white, and blue banners hung from the rafters, while tables lined the perimeter, each one showcasing different military organizations and their achievements. Sarah Chun moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in her own skin. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that drew respectful nods from those who knew her story, though she never sought attention. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest navy blue dress that gave no hint of the incredible physical conditioning beneath the fabric. To most observers, she appeared to be just another military spouse, perhaps a teacher or nurse, someone who supported the community from the sidelines. But Sarah was far from a sideline player. She had spent 15 years mastering multiple martial arts disciplines, earning her black belt in Taekwondo at 19, followed by advanced ranks in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga. More importantly, she had spent the last 8 years as a self-defense instructor, working with everyone from college students to law enforcement officers. Her reputation in the martial arts community was sterling, though she deliberately kept a low profile. Sarah believed in letting actions speak louder than credentials, a philosophy that had served her well throughout her career. Today, however, she was here simply as a supporter, someone who believed deeply in honoring those who had sacrificed for freedom. Her husband, David, a Navy SEAL who had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, was currently deployed, and Sarah often attended these events on behalf of military families who couldn't be there themselves. She understood the weight of service, the sacrifices made not just by those who served, but by their families who waited at home, hoping and praying for safe returns. The event was going beautifully. Children ran between booths, their faces painted with flags and eagles, while their parents chatted with veterans and active duty personnel. A small stage had been set up in one corner where various speakers shared stories of heroism and remembrance. The atmosphere was respectful, celebratory, and filled with genuine appreciation for military service. That atmosphere began to shift when Marcus Dalton arrived. Marcus was the kind of man who announced his presence before he even opened his mouth. At 6'3" and weighing close to 250 pounds, he had the build of a former college football player who had let himself go soft around the edges. His voice carried across rooms, his laugh was too loud, and his opinions were delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been seriously challenged. He wore expensive clothes that were just a touch too tight, gold jewelry that caught the light, and the kind of swagger that suggested he viewed every room as his personal stage. Marcus had made his money in real estate development, buying up properties and flipping them for massive profits. He was successful by most measures, driving luxury cars and living in a mansion on the hill overlooking the town. But success had bred arrogance, and arrogance had bred a sense of entitlement that made him believe his opinions carried more weight than anyone else's. He had never served in the military, never put his life on the line for anything greater than a business deal, but somehow he had convinced himself that his financial success gave him the right to judge those who had. He arrived at the charity event fashionably late, making sure his entrance was noticed. He had purchased a premium sponsorship package, which gave him access to the VIP area and a seat at the head table during the dinner portion. To most observers, his attendance seemed generous, a wealthy local businessman supporting a worthy cause. But those who knew Marcus understood that everything he did was calculated for maximum personal benefit. The charity event was networking opportunity, a chance to rub shoulders with military officials and politicians while looking good for the cameras. Sarah noticed him immediately, not because of his dramatic entrance, but because of the way the energy in the room shifted when he arrived. Conversations became slightly more forced, laughter a bit more nervous. There was something about Marcus that put people on edge, though most couldn't quite articulate what it was. Sarah, with her years of training in reading body language and assessing potential threats, recognized it immediately. Marcus was a predator, not necessarily in a physical sense, but emotionally and psychologically. He fed off making others feel small, so he could feel big. The first hour of his attendance passed without major incident. Marcus worked the room like the politician he fancied himself to be, shaking hands and making small talk. But as the evening progressed and the alcohol began to flow more freely, his true nature started to emerge. His comments became sharper, his laughter more dismissive, and his need to be the center of attention more pronounced. The trouble began during a quiet moment when Captain Rodriguez, a decorated Marine who had lost his leg to an IED in Iraq, was sharing a story about his rehabilitation and return to active duty. The crowd had gathered around respectfully, moved by his courage and determination. Captain Rodriguez spoke with quiet dignity about the challenges he had faced, not seeking pity, but rather sharing hope with others who might be facing similar struggles. Marcus, who had been standing at the back of the group with a drink in his hand, began to shift restlessly. He wasn't the center of attention, and that clearly bothered him. As Captain Rodriguez talked about the support he had received from his fellow Marines, Marcus muttered something under his breath to the man standing next to him. The comment was just loud enough to be heard by those nearby, but not quite loud enough for everyone to catch the exact words. Sarah, standing about 10 feet away, heard it clearly. Guys milking the hero thing pretty hard, don't you think? The man next to Marcus, a local business owner named Tom, looked uncomfortable and took a step away. He had served in the Army Reserves and understood the significance of Captain Rodriguez's sacrifice in a way that Marcus clearly did not. But Marcus didn't seem to notice or care about Tom's discomfort. If anything, the reaction seemed to encourage him. As Captain Rodriguez concluded his remarks to genuine applause, Marcus raised his voice just enough to be heard by a wider circle of people. Must be nice to get all that attention for doing what you signed up for, he said, his tone carrying a mixture of sarcasm and dismissal that made several people turn to look at him with expressions of shock and disgust. The comment hit the crowd like a slap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and an uncomfortable silence began to spread outward from Marcus's position. Captain Rodriguez, to his credit, maintained his composure, though the slight tightening around his eyes showed that he had heard the remark. Several veterans in the crowd exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she remained where she was, watching and listening. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to provocation was patience, allowing the provocateur to reveal their true nature to everyone present. Marcus was clearly just getting started, and Sarah suspected that giving him enough rope would allow him to hang himself in the court of public opinion. But Marcus wasn't content with one dismissive comment. As people began to turn away from him, clearly uncomfortable with his lack of respect, he seemed to interpret their reaction as a challenge rather than a rebuke. His voice grew louder, his gestures more dramatic, and his need to justify his position more pronounced. Look, I'm not saying they don't deserve respect, Marcus continued, apparently addressing anyone within earshot, but let's be honest here. Half these guys join up because they can't make it in the real world. Military gives them structure, tells them what to do, feeds them, houses them. It's not exactly Wall Street, you know what I mean? The silence that followed this comment was different from the first. Where there had been shock, now there was anger. Real, palpable anger from people who understood exactly what Marcus was suggesting. Several veterans began to move closer, their body language shifting from uncomfortable to confrontational. Sarah could see the situation escalating and knew that someone needed to de-escalate before things got ugly. Tom, the business owner who had been standing next to Marcus, finally found his voice. "Marcus, maybe you should what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the aggressive tone of someone who is used to bulldozing through disagreement. "Should pretend that the military is some kind of sacred cow that can't be criticized? Come on, Tom. We're all adults here. We can have an honest conversation." But Marcus wasn't interested in an honest conversation. He was interested in provocation, in pushing boundaries and testing limits. And as Sarah watched him work the room, she began to understand that this wasn't spontaneous rudeness. This was calculated behavior from someone who enjoyed making others uncomfortable, who fed off creating conflict and chaos. The crowd around Marcus began to thin as people moved away, not wanting to be associated with his increasingly inflammatory comments. But Marcus seemed to interpret their departure as vindication rather than rejection. In his mind, their discomfort proved that he was saying something they didn't want to hear, but needed to hear, something that challenged their comfortable assumptions. "And don't even get me started on these special forces guys," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now-quiet gymnasium. "Navy SEALs, Green Berets, all these so-called elite units. You want to know what I think? I think it's all marketing. All this mystique and secrecy, all these movies and books making them out to be superheroes. But at the end of the day, what are they really? Just guys with guns who follow orders." This comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her husband David was currently deployed with his SEAL team, risking his life in operations that Marcus couldn't even imagine, let alone understand. The men and women of Special Forces units underwent training that would break most civilians physically and mentally, develop skills that required years of dedication and sacrifice, and voluntarily place themselves in harm's way to protect people like Marcus who had never faced a day of real danger in their comfortable lives. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists, her breathing deepen, and her pulse quicken. These were the physiological responses she had been trained to recognize and control the body's preparation for conflict. But she also felt something else, something deeper and more dangerous than mere anger. She felt the cold, focused clarity that came when her training kicked in, when her mind began to calculate distances, assess threats, and prepare for action. But still, she held her position. Still, she waited. Marcus was building to something, working himself up to what Sarah suspected would be his grand finale. He had tested the waters with his earlier comments and found that while people were offended, no one was willing to confront him directly. This apparent weakness on their part seemed to embolden him, to convince him that he could say anything without consequence. "You want to know what takes real courage?" Marcus asked, his voice now loud enough that even those trying to ignore him couldn't help but hear. "Building a business from nothing. Taking real risks with your own money, your own reputation. Creating jobs, contributing to the economy. That's what built this country, not a bunch of government employees playing soldier." The phrase "playing soldier" hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah saw Captain Rodriguez's face flush red, saw the group of Marines near the memorial display turn as one to stare at Marcus, saw an elderly World War II veteran slowly rise from his chair with an expression of disbelief and rage. But Marcus wasn't finished. Not nearly finished. "I mean, let's be real here," he continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed a line that most decent people wouldn't even approach. "How hard can it really be? You get told where to go, what to do, when to do it. You don't have to think, don't have to innovate, don't have to compete in the real world. And then, when you come back, everyone's supposed to treat you like some kind of hero for doing a job you volunteered for and got paid to do." The gymnasium had gone completely silent now. Even the children seemed to sense that something was wrong, huddling closer to their parents and speaking in whispers. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant traffic outside. Every eye in the room was on Marcus, but he seemed to interpret this attention as validation rather than condemnation. Sarah realized that the moment of decision had arrived. Marcus had revealed himself completely, shown everyone exactly what kind of person he was beneath the expensive clothes and practiced charm. He had insulted not just the military as an institution, but every person in that room who had ever served, ever sacrificed, ever put their life on the line for something greater than themselves. More importantly, he had insulted her husband, her friends, her community, and her values in the most fundamental way possible. He had declared that everything they stood for, everything they had fought for, everything they had lost friends and family for was worthless. Sarah began to move. She didn't rush, didn't storm across the room in obvious anger. Instead, she moved with the controlled, purposeful grace of someone who had spent years training their body to be a precision instrument. Each step was measured, each movement economical and efficient. She wove through the crowd, not like someone pushing their way to a confrontation, but like water flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance while maintaining inexorable forward momentum. People noticed her movement and began to step aside, sensing something in her demeanor that commanded respect and attention. Unlike Marcus's loud, attention-seeking behavior, Sarah's approach was quiet and controlled, which somehow made it more compelling. Conversations stopped not because of noise, but because of the focused intensity of her presence. Marcus, still basking in what he perceived as his rhetorical triumph, didn't notice her approach at first. He was scanning the room with satisfaction, taking in the shocked faces and uncomfortable body language as evidence of his own boldness and truth-telling. In his mind, he was the brave voice of honesty in a room full of people living in comfortable delusions about military service. It wasn't until Sarah was less than 10 feet away that Marcus finally noticed her. Even then, his initial reaction was dismissive. Here was a small Asian woman in a simple dress, clearly upset by his comments, but hardly someone he needed to be concerned about. If anything, her approach seemed to validate his point about people being too sensitive about military criticism. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent gymnasium despite its conversational volume. There was something in her tone that made everyone lean in to listen, something that commanded attention without demanding it. Marcus turned to face her with a condescending smile he reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. "Yes? Can I help you with something?" Sarah stopped precisely 6 feet away from Marcus, a distance that put her just outside his immediate reach, but well within her own striking range. Her posture was relaxed, but balanced, her hands at her sides, but ready to move, her weight evenly distributed on both feet. To most observers, she simply looked like someone having a conversation. To those trained in martial arts or combat, her positioning was textbook perfect for instant action. "I heard your comments about military service," Sarah said, her voice still calm and controlled. "I was wondering if you might be willing to clarify something for me." Marcus's smile widened. Here was his opportunity to educate another misguided supporter of military hero worship, to explain the harsh realities of the world to someone who clearly didn't understand how things really worked. "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone patronizing in the extreme. "What would you like me to clarify?" "Well," Sarah said, pausing just long enough to ensure that every person in the gymnasium was hanging on her words. "When you said that military service doesn't require courage and that special forces units like the Navy SEALs are just playing soldier, I was wondering if you were speaking from personal experience." The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Marcus's smile faltered slightly as he began to sense that this conversation wasn't going to go the way he had expected. There was something in Sarah's tone, something in the way she held herself, that suggested she wasn't just another upset civilian looking to argue politics. "I don't need personal experience to recognize reality," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a slight edge of irritation. "I'm a successful businessman. I understand what real courage and real achievement look like." "I see," Sarah said, nodding thoughtfully. So you've never served in the military yourself? No, and I don't need to. Marcus shot back, his voice rising slightly. I had better things to do with my life than take orders and march around in matching outfits. A murmur rippled through the crowd at this statement. If Marcus had been content to criticize military policy or question government decisions, that might have been acceptable, even healthy debate. But he had now made it personal, suggesting that those who served had somehow chosen inferior paths in life. Sarah took one step closer, reducing the distance between them to 5 feet. Her movement was fluid and controlled, like a chess player advancing a piece with careful deliberation. That's interesting, she said, her voice still maddeningly calm. Because my husband is a Navy SEAL currently deployed overseas, and I have to say your description of his service doesn't match my experience of what he does. Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. If anything, learning that Sarah was a military spouse seemed to reinforce his sense of superiority. Here was someone who had bought into the military mythology even more completely than most, someone who needed to believe her husband was a hero to validate her own choices. Look, I'm sure your husband is a nice guy, Marcus said, his tone now openly condescending. But let's not pretend that what he does is some kind of superhuman achievement. At the end of the day, he's a government employee with a gun. I'm sure the training is tough, but so is business school. I'm sure the missions are dangerous, but so is starting a company. The difference is I did it without taxpayer funding and without expecting anyone to thank me for it. The comparison between business school and SEAL training, between starting a company and conducting special operations, was so absurd that several people in the crowd actually gasped. But Marcus seemed oblivious to their reaction, pressing forward with his argument like a man who had never encountered serious intellectual resistance. Sarah took another step forward, for feet now separated them. You know, she said, her voice taking on a slightly different quality, something that those with military experience recognized as the calm before the storm. You might be right about one thing. Maybe we shouldn't just talk about these things in the abstract. Maybe we should test your theories. Marcus's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he seemed to sense that this conversation was moving into dangerous territory. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of an audience that was clearly hoping to see him taken down a peg. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a mixture of suspicion and challenge. Sarah smiled for the first time since approaching him, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been pushed too far and was about to push back. Well, she said, you seem to think that military training and military skills are overrated. You suggested that what Special Forces personnel do isn't particularly impressive or difficult. So I was thinking, maybe you'd be willing to demonstrate your point. The crowd was completely silent now, everyone straining to hear where this conversation was heading. Marcus felt the weight of their attention and knew that backing down would be seen as weakness, would undermine everything he had said about courage and achievement. Demonstrate how? Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected where this was going and didn't like it at all. Sarah's smile widened slightly, and for the first time, Marcus caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that made his stomach clench with sudden fear. Simple, Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent gymnasium. Show everyone how easy it is to handle someone with military training. Prove that all those years of discipline and preparation don't really amount to much. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. The conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated, moving from abstract debate to personal challenge in a way that left him completely off balance. He looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from hopeful to hungry, people who clearly wanted to see him face the consequences of his words. But Marcus was nothing if not committed to his own image. He had built his entire adult life around projecting strength and confidence, around never backing down from confrontation. The idea of being seen as weak or cowardly in front of this crowd was worse than any physical threat this small woman could possibly represent. Fine, Marcus said, his voice carrying forced bravado. If you want to make this physical, I'm game. But don't expect me to go easy on you just because you're a woman. Sarah's smile didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, something so subtle that most observers missed it entirely. Her weight shifted slightly forward onto the balls of her feet. Her hands moved almost imperceptibly away from her sides, and her breathing became deeper and more controlled. I wouldn't expect anything else, Sarah replied, her voice now carrying a note of anticipation that made several veterans in the crowd exchange knowing looks. Marcus began to shrug off his expensive jacket, playing to the crowd with exaggerated movements that were designed to showcase his size and strength. At 6'3" and 250 pounds, he had a significant advantage in reach and weight, advantages he had relied on throughout his life to intimidate others. He had never been in a real fight, had never faced anyone with actual training, but he was confident that size and aggression would be enough to handle one small woman, regardless of whatever martial arts classes she might have taken. "You sure you want to do this, sweetheart?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with fake concern. "I'd hate for you to get hurt and not be able to take care of your hero husband when he gets back from playing soldier." The insult was calculated to enrage Sarah, to make her attack wildly and abandon whatever technique she might have learned. It was the kind of psychological warfare that Marcus had used successfully in business negotiations, designed to throw opponents off balance and make them act emotionally rather than strategically. But Sarah didn't take the bait. If anything, the insult seemed to center her further, to focus her attention and clarify her purpose. She had moved beyond anger into something much more dangerous: cold, professional determination. "I'm ready whenever you are," Sarah said simply. Marcus looked around the room one more time, seeing the faces of people who clearly wanted to see him humbled, who were hoping this small woman could somehow prove him wrong. His pride wouldn't let him back down, but for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. There was something about Sarah's complete confidence, something about the way she held herself, that didn't match his expectations of how this encounter should go. But it was too late to reconsider. Marcus had made his bed with his inflammatory comments and his acceptance of Sarah's challenge. Now he had to lie in it, regardless of the consequences. He raised his fists in what he imagined was a fighting stance, a pose copied from movies and television rather than any actual training. His feet were too close together, his weight too far back, his hands too low. To anyone with real combat experience, he looked like exactly what he was, an amateur trying to look tough. Sarah made no move to assume a fighting stance. She simply stood where she was, balanced and ready, her hands still at her sides, her expression calm and focused. She looked like someone waiting for a bus, not someone about to engage in physical combat. "Come on then," Marcus said, bouncing slightly on his feet in what he thought made him look dangerous and unpredictable. "Let's see what you've got." Sarah didn't move. She simply waited, watching Marcus with the patient attention of a predator studying prey. Her stillness was unnerving, completely different from the aggressive posturing that Marcus expected and was prepared to deal with. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Marcus began to feel increasingly foolish bouncing around while Sarah stood motionless, and his impatience began to override his caution. If she wasn't going to make the first move, he would have to, regardless of whatever strategic disadvantage that might create. Marcus lunged forward, leading with a wild swing that had more power than technique behind it. It was the kind of haymaker that worked in bar fights against other untrained amateurs, a blow designed to end the confrontation quickly through brute force rather than skill. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this kind of attack. As Marcus committed himself to the swing, she moved. What happened next took place in less than 2 seconds, but to those watching, it seemed to unfold in slow motion, each movement clear and distinct and somehow inevitable. Sarah moved like water flowing around stone, her body shifting with fluid precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training and muscle memory developed through countless repetitions. As Marcus's wild swing cut through the air, where she had been standing just a fraction of a second before, Sarah stepped inside his guard with the economy of motion that marked true martial arts mastery. Her first technique was deceptively simple, a basic wrist control that redirected Marcus's momentum while simultaneously off-balancing him. To the untrained eye, it looked like she had barely touched him, just a gentle contact that somehow sent his powerful punch sailing harmlessly past her shoulder. But to those who understood grappling and joint manipulation, it was a textbook demonstration of using an attacker's force against them, turning strength into weakness through superior positioning and technique. Marcus, suddenly finding himself overextended and off balance, tried to recover by throwing his other hand in a desperate backhand. But Sarah was already inside his range, too close for his longer reach to be effective, and his second attack was even wilder and more uncontrolled than his first. She deflected it almost casually with her forearm, while simultaneously sweeping his lead leg with her foot, a combination that sent Marcus stumbling sideways across the polished gymnasium floor. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus tried to regain his footing, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. He had expected to overwhelm Sarah with size and aggression to end this encounter quickly and decisively. Instead, he found himself flailing around like an amateur while she moved with the controlled grace of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. "Stand still and fight," Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the gymnasium walls. The demand revealed everything about his inexperience and his growing desperation. In his mind, fighting was supposed to be a straightforward test of strength and, well, two people standing toe-to-toe and throwing punches until one of them fell down. The idea that combat could be strategic, that movement and positioning could be more important than raw power, was completely foreign to his understanding. Sarah didn't respond to his outburst. She simply reset her position, once again assuming the relaxed but ready stance that had served her so well throughout her martial arts career. Her breathing was still controlled, her expression still calm, showing no signs of the exertion that Marcus was already beginning to feel. If anything, she looked like she was just getting warmed up. Marcus charged at her again, this time trying to use his superior size to simply run her down, to tackle her to the ground where he imagined his weight advantage would be decisive. It was a strategy born of desperation rather than tactical thinking, the kind of wild assault that usually worked against other untrained fighters but was suicide against someone with real defensive skills. Sarah saw the charge coming from across the room. She had time to analyze Marcus's approach, to calculate the best response, to position herself for maximum advantage. As he thundered toward her like an angry bull, she waited until the last possible second before moving, her timing so precise that several spectators gasped in appreciation of what they had just witnessed. Instead of moving directly out of Marcus's path, Sarah stepped at an angle that put her just outside his charge, while allowing her to maintain contact with his body. As he passed by her, she helped him along with a perfectly timed hip throw that used his own momentum to launch him across the gymnasium floor. Marcus hit the ground hard, rolling several times before coming to rest against the base of the memorial display. The sound of his impact echoed through the silent gymnasium, followed by Marcus's groans as he struggled to get back to his feet. His expensive shirt was torn, his carefully styled hair was disheveled, and dirt from the gymnasium floor had left streaks across his clothes. More importantly, his confidence was shattered, replaced by the dawning realization that he was completely outclassed. But Marcus's pride wouldn't let him quit. As he pulled himself upright, using the memorial display for support, his embarrassment transformed into rage. In his mind, he wasn't losing because Sarah was more skilled, but because she was using some kind of trickery, some unfair advantage that prevented him from showing his true strength. The idea that he might simply be wrong about military training, wrong about the value of discipline and dedication, was too threatening to his self-image to be considered. Lucky shots. Marcus panted, wiping blood from his lip where he had bitten it during the fall. Let's see how you do when I'm ready for your little tricks. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew colder. She had given Marcus multiple opportunities to walk away with his dignity intact, chances to admit his mistakes and apologize for his disrespectful comments. Instead, he had chosen to escalate the confrontation, to double down on his arrogance, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he was wrong. "I'm not using tricks," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "This is just basic technique. The kind of thing taught in any legitimate martial arts school or in military combatives training." The implication was clear, though Sarah didn't state it directly. Everything she had done so far represented fundamental skills that any properly trained fighter would possess. She wasn't showing off advanced techniques or secret moves, just the building blocks that formed the foundation of effective combat training. If Marcus was this overwhelmed by basic defensive maneuvers, what did that say about his earlier claims regarding military capabilities? Marcus understood the implication, and it made him even angrier. He began moving towards Sarah again, but this time with more caution, try to learn from his previous mistakes. He kept his hands up in a guard position, advanced more slowly, and attempted to control the distance between them. For a moment, it looked like he might have learned something from his early failures. But experience couldn't be learned in seconds, and tactical thinking couldn't be developed on the fly. As Marcus closed the distance, Sarah began to demonstrate techniques that were several levels beyond what she had shown before. Where her earlier movements had been defensive, designed to neutralize his attacks without causing serious harm, now she began to take the initiative. Her first offensive technique was a low kick to Marcus's lead leg, a strike that hit the common peroneal nerve with surgical precision. The kick looked almost gentle, more like a tap than a serious attack, but Marcus's leg immediately went numb from the knee down. He stumbled, his carefully maintained guard position collapsing as he struggled to maintain his balance on an unresponsive limb. Before Marcus could recover, Sarah followed up with a rapid series of techniques that showcased different aspects of her training. A palm strike to his solar plexus drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and unable to mount any kind of counterattack. A joint lock applied to his wrist bent his arm into a position that made resistance impossible without risking serious injury. A sweep that targeted his remaining functional leg sent him crashing to the ground once again. The entire combination took less than 5 seconds from start to finish, flowing together with the kind of seamless integration that could only come from years of dedicated practice. Marcus found himself face down on the gymnasium floor, his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that made any movement painful, his breathing labored from the body shot, his legs still partially numb from the nerve strike. "Do you yield?" Sarah asked, her voice still calm despite the physical exertion. The question was asked without mockery or gloating, simply a professional inquiry about whether her opponent was ready to concede the match. Marcus's answer came in the form of a desperate attempt to break free from the hold, thrashing around on the floor like a landed fish. But Sarah's technique was too precise, her positioning too advantageous. Every movement he made only served to tighten the joint lock, bringing him closer to the point where continued resistance would result in actual injury. "Asked if you yield," Sarah repeated, applying just enough additional pressure to make her point clear. She had no desire to seriously hurt Marcus, but she was also not going to allow him to continue this charade indefinitely. He needed to acknowledge what had happened, needed to understand the reality of his situation. "Never," Marcus gasped, his voice strained by his awkward position and the pressure on his arm. "I'll never give up to some little girl playing fighter." The insult hung in the air like a slap, revealing that Marcus had learned nothing from the encounter. Despite being thoroughly outclassed, despite having his claims about military training decisively disproven, he still couldn't accept the reality of what was happening. In his mind, his failure wasn't evidence of his own ignorance, but proof that the system was somehow rigged against him. Sarah released the joint lock and stepped back, allowing Marcus to struggle back to his feet. She had hoped that the demonstration would be enough, that showing him the reality of trained versus untrained combat would be sufficient to make her point. But it was becoming clear that Marcus was incapable of learning from experience, too invested in his own narrative to accept contradictory evidence. "You know what your problem is?" Sarah asked as Marcus swayed unsteadily, his body showing the cumulative effects of multiple impacts and joint manipulations. "You think courage is about talking tough and acting aggressive. You think strength is about being bigger and louder than everyone else. But real courage is about facing your fears and your limitations honestly. Real strength is about the discipline to train and improve, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable." Marcus wiped blood from his nose, his breathing still labored from the earlier body shot. But instead of showing any sign of understanding or introspection, his expression grew even more hostile. Sarah's words had hit too close to home, had threatened the foundation of his self-image in a way that made rational response impossible. "You think you're so smart," Marcus snarled, his voice carrying the venom of a wounded ego. "You think you've proved something here? All you've proved is that you're willing to assault someone at a charity event. Real classy. I'm sure your husband would be proud." The comment about her husband crossed a line that Marcus didn't even realize existed. Throughout the encounter, Sarah had maintained her professional composure, treating the situation as a training exercise rather than a personal vendetta. But bringing David into it, suggesting that her defense of his service and sacrifice was somehow shameful, touched something deep and primal in her emotional core. For the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah's expression changed. The calm professionalism was still there, but underneath it, something much more dangerous had awakened. Marcus, despite his complete lack of tactical awareness, seemed to sense the shift. He took an instinctive step backward, suddenly aware that he had just made a serious mistake. "You want to bring my husband into this?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You want to question his honor after everything you've already said tonight?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in the encounter, he seemed to understand that he was in genuine danger, that his provocative words had pushed someone beyond the point of measured response. The playground bully in him recognized something that his adult mind couldn't quite process. He had awakened something that was much more dangerous than anything he was prepared to handle. "Let me tell you about my husband," Sarah continued, her voice still carrying that deadly quiet tone. "David joined the Navy when he was 18 because he wanted to serve something greater than himself. He spent 2 years just trying to qualify for SEAL training, pushing his body and mind to limits you can't even imagine. The dropout rate is over 80%, and those are from people who are already elite athletes and top performers." Sarah began walking slowly toward Marcus as she spoke, her movement controlled and predatory. Marcus found himself backing away, his previous aggression completely forgotten in the face of something that felt genuinely threatening. When David finally made it through basic underwater demolition and SEAL training, he was one of 12 men out of an initial class of 63. 12 men who had proven they could perform under pressure that would break most people mentally and physically. Men who had demonstrated they could be trusted with the lives of their teammates and the success of missions that most people never even hear about. Marcus continued backing away until he bumped into the memorial display, trapped between Sarah's advance and the wall behind him. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the growing realization that he was dealing with someone who operated on a completely different level than anything in his experience. "David has completed 3 combat deployments," Sarah continued, now standing just outside striking range. "He has participated in operations that saved civilian lives, gathered intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks, and eliminated threats that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. He has risked his life repeatedly for people he has never met and will never know, including people like you who question his dedication and his courage." The gymnasium was completely silent now, every person present hanging on Sarah's words. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, the importance of what was being said. This wasn't just a response to Marcus's insults, but a statement about values and sacrifice that went to the heart of why the charity event existed in the first place. And while he was doing all of that, Sarah said, her voice beginning to rise for the first time, while he was training and deploying and bleeding and sacrificing, what were you doing? Building your real estate empire? Making money? Living comfortably while other people paid the price for your freedom and security? Marcus tried to interrupt, to defend himself, but Sarah continued without pause. She had held back her emotions throughout the physical confrontation, but now they were finally finding expression through words rather than technique. You have never put your life on the line for anyone but yourself. You have never faced real danger, never made a sacrifice that actually cost you something important, never tested yourself against anything more challenging than a business negotiation. And yet you have the audacity to stand in a room full of people who have served, who have sacrificed, who have lost friends and family members in service to this country, and tell them that their dedication means nothing. The truth of Sarah's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every point she made was accurate, every accusation justified by his own behavior throughout the evening. He had indeed lived a comfortable, safe life while others faced danger on his behalf. He had indeed built his success on a foundation provided by people whose sacrifices he had just finished mocking. But acknowledging these truths would require a level of humility and self-reflection that Marcus had spent his entire adult life avoiding. His success had always been based on projecting strength and confidence, on never admitting weakness or error. The idea of backing down now, in front of all these people, was psychologically impossible for him to process. "I don't have to listen to this," Marcus said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I don't have to stand here and be lectured by some military wife who thinks she's tough because she took a few karate classes." The comment revealed that Marcus had learned absolutely nothing from what had just happened. Despite being thoroughly dominated in the physical confrontation, despite having his lack of training exposed in the most public way possible, he was still clinging to the delusion that Sarah's success had been based on luck or some kind of unfair advantage. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her expression shifting from anger to something that might have been pity. She had given him every opportunity to show grace, to acknowledge his mistakes, to demonstrate some measure of the character he claimed to possess. Instead, he had revealed himself to be exactly what she had suspected from the beginning, a bully who was only strong when facing people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. "A few karate classes," Sarah repeated, her voice now carrying a note of genuine amusement. "Is that what you think this was?" She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them, speaking directly to the veterans and active duty personnel who had watched the encounter unfold. "How many of you recognize what just happened here?" Sarah asked. "How many of you have seen these techniques before, either in your own training or in demonstrations by hand-to-hand combat instructors?" Several hands went up throughout the crowd, including those of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had undergone military combatives training. Their expressions showed recognition and approval, the professional appreciation of people who understood exactly what they had witnessed. Captain Rodriguez, the Marine who had been speaking when Marcus first made his disrespectful comments, raised his hand and spoke up. "Ma'am, what I saw was a textbook demonstration of close-quarters combat techniques. Joint manipulation, leverage-based throws, pressure point strikes, tactical positioning. That wasn't karate class material. That was military-level training." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd as other veterans nodded their recognition. Sarah's techniques hadn't been flashy or exotic, but they had been devastatingly effective and precisely executed. Most importantly, they had been exactly the kind of skills that military personnel were taught for situations where weapons weren't available or appropriate. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "I should probably introduce myself properly. My name is Sarah Chun, and I'm a certified instructor in multiple martial arts disciplines, including military combatives. I've been training law enforcement and military personnel in hand-to-hand combat techniques for the past 8 years. The revelation hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. He had assumed Sarah was just an angry military spouse, someone with perhaps some basic self-defense training who had gotten lucky in their encounter. The reality was that he had just challenged a professional combat instructor, someone whose job was literally to teach fighting techniques to people whose lives might depend on that knowledge. I hold black belts in Taekwondo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Krav Maga, Sarah continued. I'm also certified in several military and law enforcement combatives programs, including Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, Army Combatives, and various federal agency defensive tactic systems. What you experienced tonight wasn't a lucky break or a few random techniques. It was a professional demonstration of skills that take years to develop and maintain. The crowd was now looking at Marcus with expressions that ranged from pity to outright contempt. His ignorant comments about military training had been bad enough, but challenging someone of Sarah's caliber to a fight showed a level of arrogance and stupidity that was almost breathtaking in its scope. Marcus felt the weight of their judgment and knew that his reputation in this community was effectively destroyed. Everyone present would remember this night, would remember his disrespectful comments and his humiliating defeat. The comfortable social position he had built through wealth and bluster was crumbling around him, leaving him exposed as someone who was all talk and no substance. But even in the face of complete social annihilation, Marcus couldn't bring himself to admit fault. His pride, the same pride that had driven him to success in business, now prevented him from taking the steps that might have salvaged some measure of respect from the situation. "So what?" Marcus said, his voice desperate and defiant. "So you're some kind of professional fighter. That doesn't change anything about what I said. The military is still just a government job, and all your fancy techniques don't change that basic fact." The statement showed such a fundamental misunderstanding of what had just occurred that several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud. Marcus had just been definitively proven wrong about military training capabilities, had experienced firsthand the reality of discipline and skill that he had dismissed as meaningless, and his response was to double down on the same ignorant claims that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. Sarah shook her head slowly, recognizing that Marcus was beyond reach of reason or evidence. Some people were simply too invested in their own narratives to accept contradictory information, no matter how overwhelming that information might be. "You're right about one thing," Sarah said finally. "This doesn't change what you said. Nothing can change that. Everyone here heard you dismiss the service and sacrifice of people who have given more for this country than you ever will. Everyone here saw you mock the memory of fallen heroes and the dedication of those who serve. And everyone here witnessed what happens when ignorance meets expertise." She gestured toward the memorial display behind Marcus, where the names of local service members who had died in combat were engraved in black granite. Those names represent people who made the ultimate sacrifice for ideals you clearly don't understand. They died so that people like you could live in safety and comfort, could build businesses and accumulate wealth without fear of foreign invasion or terrorist attack. And your response to their sacrifice is to call them government employees who were just playing soldier. The comparison between Marcus's comfortable life and the sacrifices of those honored by the memorial was stark and undeniable. Everyone present could see the contrast, could understand the moral and ethical chasm between those who serve others and those who serve only themselves. Marcus looked around the room, seeing faces that had shifted from mere disapproval to active disgust. His social position in the community wasn't just damaged, it was completely destroyed. He would never again be able to attend a public event without people remembering this night, remembering his cowardice and his disrespect. The weight of that realization finally broke through his pride and denial. For the first time, Marcus seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had done, the bridges he had burned, the reputation he had destroyed through his own arrogance and ignorance. But Understanding wasn't the same as accepting responsibility, and Marcus had spent too many years avoiding accountability to start now. Instead of acknowledging his mistakes, instead of apologizing for his disrespectful comments, he chose the coward's way out. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice carrying forced bravado that fooled no one. "I don't have to stand here and listen to this self-righteous nonsense. I came here to support a good cause, and I get attacked by some military fanatic who thinks violence solves everything." The attempt to reframe the situation, to cast himself as the victim and Sarah as the aggressor, was so transparent that it actually made his position worse. Everyone present had heard his original comments, had witnessed his acceptance of Sarah's challenge, had seen him initiate the physical confrontation. His attempt to play the victim now only emphasized his lack of character and integrity. Sarah didn't respond to his accusation. She had said what needed to be said, demonstrated what needed to be demonstrated. Marcus had revealed his true nature completely, and no amount of additional argument would change minds that had already been made up by direct observation. Marcus began moving toward the exit, his departure as dramatic and attention-seeking as his arrival had been. But where his entrance had been confident and commanding, his exit was hurried and defensive, the retreat of someone who knew he had been thoroughly defeated and humiliated. As he reached the gymnasium doors, Marcus turned back for one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I'll be filing complaints about this assault. We'll see how tough your black belt is in a courtroom." The threat was empty, and everyone knew it. Marcus had initiated the confrontation, had accepted Sarah's challenge, and had been recorded by multiple cell phones throughout the encounter. Any legal action he might attempt would only serve to publicize his humiliation further and expose him to additional scrutiny. But, more importantly, the threat revealed that Marcus still didn't understand what had happened. This hadn't been about violence or aggression or proving physical dominance. It had been about truth and consequences, about the reality that words have meaning and actions have results. Marcus had spent years hiding behind his wealth and social position, insulated from the consequences of his behavior by the deference that money could buy. Tonight, he had encountered someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth, wasn't intimidated by his bluster, and wasn't willing to let his disrespect go unchallenged. He had discovered that in the real world, the world outside his comfortable bubble of privilege, character, and capability mattered more than bank accounts and business cards. As Marcus disappeared through the exit doors, the gymnasium remained silent for several moments. People looked at each other, processed what they had witnessed, and gradually began to return to their conversations and activities. But the energy in the room had changed, shifted from the uncomfortable tension that Marcus had created to something lighter and more positive. Sarah stood in the center of the space for a moment longer, allowing her adrenaline to settle and her breathing to return to normal. The physical confrontation had been brief and relatively mild by the standards of her training, but the emotional intensity had been significant. She had been forced to defend not just her own honor, but the honor of her husband and everyone who had ever worn the uniform. Captain Rodriguez approached her, his expression showing respect and gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for what you did tonight. That man needed to be taught a lesson, and you did it in exactly the right way." Other veterans began to gather around Sarah, offering their own thanks and appreciation. They understood what had happened better than the civilian attendees, recognized the professional skill and restraint she had shown throughout the encounter. Marcus could have been seriously injured if Sarah had chosen to escalate the confrontation, but instead she had demonstrated just enough capability to make her point without causing lasting harm. "I hope I didn't make things worse," Sarah said, her voice showing the exhaustion that was beginning to set in as her adrenaline faded. "I know this kind of thing isn't exactly appropriate for a charity event. Sometimes inappropriate is exactly what's needed. replied Master Sergeant Williams, an Army veteran who had served 3 tours in Iraq. Some people only learn when they face consequences for their actions. That man has probably been running his mouth for years without anyone calling him on it. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with various attendees sharing their own experiences with people like Marcus, individuals who felt entitled to disrespect military service without having any understanding of what that service actually entailed. But gradually, the focus of the event returned to its original purpose, honoring those who had served and supporting those who continued to serve. Sarah found herself at the center of a different kind of attention now, people seeking her out not because of the confrontation, but because of her professional expertise and her connection to the military community. Several parents approached her about self-defense classes for their children, law enforcement officers asked about training opportunities, and fellow military spouses thanked her for standing up to someone who had insulted their families. The remainder of the evening passed peacefully, with Marcus's dramatic exit serving as a kind of cleansing ritual that allowed the community to refocus on what really mattered. The charity raised more money than expected, the memorial ceremony honored the fallen appropriately, and the various displays and demonstrations educated civilians about military life and service. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the real lesson had been about character and consequences, about the difference between real strength and mere bluster, about the importance of backing up words with actions and being prepared to face the results of both. As Sarah finally prepared to leave the event, she reflected on what had occurred and what it meant. She had not sought out the confrontation with Marcus, had given him multiple opportunities to avoid it, and had used the minimum force necessary to make her point. But she had also demonstrated something important about the value of training, discipline, and dedication, qualities that Marcus had dismissed but which had proven decisive when put to the test. More importantly, she had defended the honor of people who couldn't defend themselves, people like her husband who were serving overseas and couldn't respond to insults, and mockery from comfortable civilians who had never faced real danger or made real sacrifices. The drive home gave Sarah time to decompress and process what had happened. She knew that video of the confrontation would probably end up on social media, that the story would spread through the community and possibly beyond. She hoped that the attention would focus on the real issues raised by Marcus's comments rather than just the spectacle of the physical encounter. But regardless of how others interpreted what had occurred, Sarah knew that she had done the right thing. Sometimes standing up for principles required more than words, required demonstrating through actions the reality of beliefs and values that others might try to dismiss or mock. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David, sent from whatever forward operating base he was currently deployed to, wherever his mission had taken him in service to his country. Heard about what happened tonight. The message read, "Proud of you for standing up for what's right. Love you." Sarah smiled as she read the message, knowing that somehow, across thousands of miles and despite operational security requirements, news of the evening's events had already reached her husband. The military community was small and tightly connected, and significant events traveled fast through informal networks of communication. She typed back a quick response. "Just did what you would have done if you were here. Love you too. Stay safe." As Sarah settled in for the night, she reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred. Marcus represented a certain type of person, someone who benefited from the sacrifices of others while remaining ignorant of or dismissive toward those sacrifices. He wasn't evil or malicious, just selfish and unaware, the product of a society that allowed people to remain comfortable and insulated from the realities that enable their comfort. But incidents like tonight serve an important purpose, forcing confrontations between different worldviews and value systems that might otherwise coexist without ever truly engaging with each other. Marcus had been forced to confront the reality of training and discipline, the gap between his assumptions and actual facts, the difference between theoretical criticism and practical capability. Whether he would learn from the experience remained to be seen, but at the very least, his disrespectful comments had been answered, his false claims had been disproven, and his arrogance had been humbled in a very public way. The community would remember what had happened, would understand the lesson that had been taught, and would hopefully be more careful about allowing such disrespect to go unchallenged in the future. The charity event had succeeded in its primary mission of honoring service and supporting veterans, but it had also served an unintended secondary purpose of educating people about the reality of military capabilities and the character of those who possess them. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she was already looking forward to David's return, to sharing with him the details of what had occurred and hearing his perspective on the confrontation. She knew he would be proud of how she had handled the situation, how she had used her skills not for aggression or dominance, but for defense of honor and principle. The night's events had reminded her why her training mattered, why the discipline and dedication required for martial arts mastery served purposes beyond just physical fitness or competitive achievement. In a world where words were cheap and opinions were plentiful, the ability to back up beliefs with action, to demonstrate rather than just declare, remained as important as ever. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way, in the most public and embarrassing way possible. But sometimes that was what it took to break through the barriers of ignorance and arrogance, to force people to confront realities they would rather ignore. The community was stronger for what had happened, more unified in its appreciation for service and sacrifice, more aware of the difference between those who serve and those who merely benefit from that service. And Sarah had played her part in that education, using her skills and her position to defend values that were bigger than any individual confrontation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference, but tonight had shown that when principles were threatened, when honor was questioned, when service was mocked, there were still people willing to stand up and respond with both words and deeds. The lesson had been taught, the point had been made, and the community had been reminded of what really mattered. For Sarah, that was more than enough. 3 weeks after the charity event, the ripple effects of that night continued to spread through the community like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The confrontation between Sarah Chun and Marcus Dalton had become the kind of local legend that people would talk about for years. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations about respect, service, and the true meaning of courage that went far beyond the immediate participants. For Sarah, life had settled into a new rhythm that reflected her unexpected prominence in the community. Her self-defense classes, which had previously attracted a modest but dedicated group of students, suddenly had waiting lists extending months into the future. Parents who had never considered martial arts training for their children were calling to ask about youth programs. Law enforcement agencies from 3 counties had reached out about specialized training workshops. Local colleges were inviting her to speak about discipline, dedication, and the practical applications of martial arts philosophy. The attention was flattering, but also overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to let her actions speak louder than her words. Sarah found herself struggling to balance the increased demand for her time with her existing commitments and her desire to maintain the quality of instruction that had built her reputation in the first place. Every new student who walked into her dojo carried with them the story of what had happened at the charity event, and most of them expected to learn not just techniques, but something about the character and principles that had enabled Sarah to handle such a confrontational situation with grace and effectiveness. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred during a training session with Detective Maria Santos, a veteran police officer who had been studying with Sarah for over 2 years. Maria had been at the charity event and had witnessed the entire confrontation, but it wasn't until their next training session that she fully processed what she had observed. Even when he was saying those horrible things about your husband, about military service in general, you never lost control. Sarah paused in her demonstration, considering how to respond. The question touched on something that had been central to her martial arts training from the very beginning: the relationship between physical technique and mental discipline between external control and internal mastery. That's really the whole point of training, Sarah explained, resetting her position for the next technique. Anyone can learn to throw a punch or execute a takedown if they practice enough. But learning to control your emotional responses, to think clearly under pressure, to respond rather than react, that's what separates martial arts from just fighting. Maria nodded, understanding the distinction on an intellectual level, but still struggling with the practical application. As a police officer, she had been trained to manage high-stress situations, but there was something different about the kind of control that Sarah had demonstrated, something that went beyond professional training to touch on fundamental questions of character and philosophy. But how do you get there? Maria asked. I mean, if someone was saying those things about my family, about my husband's service, I don't know if I could have stayed that composed. I probably would have lost it completely. Sarah smiled, recognizing in Maria's question the same struggle that every serious martial artist faced at some point in their development. The technical aspects of combat training were relatively straightforward, measurable, and improvable through repetition and practice. But the mental and emotional components required a different kind of work, a deeper examination of personal values and psychological responses that many people found uncomfortable or difficult. It's not about suppressing anger or pretending you don't feel it, Sarah explained, moving into a position where she could demonstrate the concept physically. It's about understanding that anger is just information, like pain or fatigue. It tells you something important is happening, but it doesn't have to control your response. She gestured for Maria to attack with a realistic level of aggression and intensity, creating the kind of situation where emotional responses naturally wanted to take over. As Maria launched her attack, Sarah's response was fluid and controlled, neutralizing the threat while maintaining the kind of strategic thinking that panic or anger would have made impossible. When Marcus was saying those things about military service, about David, I definitely felt angry, Sarah continued as they reset for another repetition. But I also recognized that his comments came from ignorance rather than malice. He didn't understand what he was talking about, hadn't experienced the things he was criticizing, and was basically just repeating prejudices and assumptions that he had never examined. Maria attacked again, this time with even more intensity, trying to create the kind of pressure that would test Sarah's ability to maintain her composure. But Sarah's response remained measured and effective, using precisely the amount of force necessary to control the situation without escalating beyond what was required. More importantly, Sarah said, I realized that losing control would have undermined everything I was trying to defend. If I had gotten angry and sloppy, if I had used excessive force or let my emotions drive my actions, then Marcus could have claimed that military training just made people violent and aggressive. By staying controlled and professional, I was able to demonstrate exactly the kind of discipline and character that he was claiming didn't exist. The conversation continued as they worked through various scenarios, but Maria found herself thinking about the broader implications of what Sarah was describing. The principle of maintaining emotional control under pressure wasn't just applicable to physical confrontations. It was relevant to every challenging situation that life presented, from difficult family conversations to professional conflicts to the kind of societal tensions that seemed to be increasing every year. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Dalton was discovering that the consequences of his behavior extended far beyond the embarrassment of that single evening. The video of his confrontation with Sarah had indeed made its way to social media, where it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times and shared across multiple platforms. But unlike many viral videos that generated momentary attention before being forgotten, this one had sparked sustained discussion about military service, civilian-military relations, and the importance of backing up opinions with understanding. The business community that had once welcomed Marcus's contributions and courted his investments now treated him with polite but distant professionalism. Charity organizations that had previously sought his financial support found reasons to exclude him from planning committees and social events. The country club that had been his primary social venue suddenly felt less welcoming, with conversations stopping when he approached and invitations to private gatherings mysteriously failing to arrive. Most damaging of all, potential business partners were beginning to ask questions about his character and judgment. Real estate development required collaboration with banks, contractors, government officials, and community leaders, all of whom needed to trust that Marcus could represent their interests professionally and diplomatically. The video of him drunkenly challenging a woman to a fight at a charity event, then being systematically outclassed and humiliated, raised serious questions about his decision-making abilities and his capacity to handle stress and conflict appropriately. Marcus tried various strategies to rehabilitate his reputation. He hired a public relations firm to help craft a narrative that portrayed him as the victim of an unprovoked attack, someone who had simply been expressing legitimate opinions about government spending and military policy before being assaulted by an unstable individual. But the existence of video evidence made such spin attempts largely ineffective, and most media outlets that covered the story focused on his disrespectful comments and poor judgment rather than any claims of victimization. He also attempted to pursue legal action against Sarah, filing complaints with local police about assault and battery. But the investigation quickly revealed that Marcus had initiated the confrontation, had accepted Sarah's challenge, and had thrown the first punch, all while being recorded by multiple witnesses. The prosecutor's office declined to pursue charges, noting that Sarah's actions appeared to be clearly defensive and proportionate to the threat she faced. The failure of these efforts forced Marcus to confront a reality that his wealth and social position had previously allowed him to avoid. Actions have consequences, and some consequences cannot be bought, spun, or litigated away. The reputation he had spent years building through financial success and social manipulation was crumbling, and he had no effective tools to repair the damage. 3 months after the charity event, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He sold his real estate development company to a larger firm, liquidated most of his local investments, and announced that he was moving to another state to pursue new opportunities. The move was framed as a strategic business decision, an expansion into new markets that would leverage his experience and connections. But everyone understood what was really happening. Marcus was running away from the consequences of his behavior, abandoning a community where his reputation had been permanently damaged in favor of starting over somewhere else. It was the ultimate admission that he had lost the social and professional standing that had defined his identity for most of his adult life. The irony was not lost on those who had witnessed the original confrontation. Marcus had questioned the courage and commitment of people who chose to serve in the military, people who faced danger and hardship in defense of principles larger than themselves. But when faced with the relatively minor consequence of social disapproval for his own poor behavior, Marcus chose the path of retreat and abandonment rather than staying to face the results of his actions. His departure became another part of the story that people told about that night at the charity event, another lesson about the difference between real character and mere posturing, between those who stand up for their beliefs and those who run away when those beliefs are challenged. For the military community, Marcus's exodus felt like a kind of vindication, proof that their values of honor, commitment, and accountability still mattered in a world that often seemed to reward selfishness and superficiality. Captain Rodriguez, the Marine who had been speaking when Marcus first made his disrespectful comments, summed up the general sentiment at a veterans gathering several weeks later. Some people think they can say whatever they want without consequences, Rodriguez observed. They think that money or status gives them the right to insult others and then walk away when things get uncomfortable. But character isn't about what you say when it's easy and safe. Character is about what you do when things get difficult, when you have to choose between what's convenient and what's right. The veterans in attendance nodded their agreement, understanding from their own experience the truth of Rodriguez's observation. Military service was fundamentally about making difficult choices, about prioritizing duty and mission accomplishment over personal comfort and convenience. It was about staying committed to principles even when those principles required sacrifice and hardship. Marcus had revealed through his behavior that he understood none of this, that his entire worldview was based on privilege and entitlement rather than service and sacrifice. His decision to leave rather than face the consequences of his actions only confirmed what many had suspected from the beginning, that his criticisms of military service came not from any real understanding or alternative philosophy, but from a fundamental inability to comprehend what motivated people to serve others. Back at her dojo, Sarah continued to work with students who came seeking not just self-defense skills, but guidance on how to live with integrity and purpose in a complex world. The incident with Marcus had become a teaching tool, a real-world example of how principles were tested and character was revealed through action rather than words. One evening, as Sarah was working with a group of teenagers whose parents had enrolled them after hearing about the charity event confrontation, one of the students asked a question that got to the heart of what many people were thinking. "Sensei," asked 16-year-old Jake Morrison, whose father was an Army sergeant, "why didn't you just walk away when that guy started saying those things? I mean, you could have just ignored him and avoided the whole situation." Sarah paused in her demonstration, recognizing the importance of the question and the opportunity it presented to discuss concepts that went beyond physical technique to touch on fundamental questions of ethics and responsibility. "That's actually a really good question, Jake," Sarah replied, setting down the training equipment she had been using. "And there are situations where walking away is absolutely the right choice. If someone is just trying to provoke you, if engaging with them won't accomplish anything positive, if the cost of confrontation outweighs any possible benefit, then disengagement is often the wisest strategy." She moved to the center of the mat, where all the students could see and hear her clearly, and gestured for them to gather around in the informal circle they used for philosophical discussions. But there are also times when walking away becomes a form of enabling, when our silence allows harmful behavior to continue and escalate. That night at the charity event, Marcus wasn't just expressing unpopular opinions or making casual comments that I happened to disagree with. He was directly insulting people who couldn't defend themselves, mocking the sacrifice of those who had died in service to their country, and spreading ignorance that could influence other people's attitudes toward military service. Jake nodded, beginning to understand the distinction Sarah was making, but still struggling with the practical implications. "But couldn't you have just argued with him? Did it have to become physical?" Sarah smiled, recognizing in Jake's question the same struggle that many adults faced when trying to balance ideals with practical realities. The notion that all conflicts could be resolved through rational discussion was appealing, but naive, ignoring the reality that some people were immune to logical argument or moral persuasion. "I tried talking with him," Sarah explained. "I asked him clarifying questions, gave him opportunities to back down or modify his position, and attempted to engage him in actual dialogue rather than just confrontation. But Marcus wasn't interested in discussion or learning. He was interested in provocation and dominance, in making himself feel important by making others feel small." She moved into a ready position, demonstrating the kind of calm alertness that had served her so well during the actual confrontation. When he accepted my challenge to demonstrate his theories about military training, he made a choice about how the situation would be resolved. At that point, talking was no longer an option. The question became whether his ignorant assumptions about military capabilities would be allowed to stand unchallenged, or whether they would be tested against reality. Another student, 17-year-old Rebecca Chun, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, raised her hand with a question that showed she had been thinking deeply about the moral implications of what had occurred. "But wasn't it kind of unfair?" Rebecca asked. "I mean, you're a professional instructor with years of training, and he was just some businessman who probably never had a real fight in his life. Didn't you have an unfair advantage?" Sarah considered the question carefully, recognizing the ethical complexity that Rebecca was identifying. The disparity in skill and training between her and Marcus had been enormous, raising legitimate questions about the fairness of the confrontation and the appropriateness of her response. "You're absolutely right about the disparity in training and experience," Sarah acknowledged. "In a fair competition between equals, what happened that night would have been completely inappropriate. But Marcus wasn't challenging me to a fair competition. He was dismissing the value of training and discipline in general, claiming that military skills were overrated and that dedication to service was meaningless." She gestured toward the memorial wall in her dojo, where photos of local service members who had been killed in action serve as a constant reminder of the ultimate cost of military service. More importantly, he was insulting people who couldn't defend themselves. Service members who were deployed overseas, veterans who had been injured in combat, families who had lost loved ones in service to their country. In that context, the question wasn't whether the confrontation was fair to Marcus, but whether allowing his disrespect to go unchallenged was fair to the people he was insulting. Rebecca nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader ethical framework that had guided Sarah's decision-making that night. The concept of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves was central to many martial arts philosophies, but seeing it applied in a real-world situation helped clarify how abstract principles translated into concrete action. Besides, Sarah added with a slight smile, Marcus made the choice to escalate to physical confrontation. He could have walked away at any point, could have apologized for his comments, could have acknowledged that he might not fully understand the things he was criticizing. Instead, he chose to double down on his ignorance and challenge someone to prove him wrong. I just accommodated his request. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with various students asking questions about conflict resolution, the appropriate use of force, and the responsibility that came with martial arts training. It was exactly the kind of conversation that Sarah hoped would result from her teaching, moving beyond simple technique instruction to explore the deeper questions of character and ethics that made martial arts relevant to all aspects of life. As the class ended and students began to leave, Jake approached Sarah with one final question that had clearly been weighing on his mind throughout the discussion. "Sensei," Jake said, "do you think the guy learned anything from what happened? Do you think he understands now why he was wrong?" Sarah considered the question while she gathered her equipment and prepared to close the dojo for the evening. It was the kind of question that touched on fundamental assumptions about human nature, about the capacity for growth and change, about whether experiences could truly alter deeply held beliefs and attitudes. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "People like Marcus often have a lot invested in maintaining their existing worldview, even when that worldview is challenged by contradictory evidence. It's easier to find excuses and alternative explanations than to admit that you've been fundamentally wrong about something important." She turned off the lights in the main training area and walked toward the exit with Jake, continuing their conversation in the parking lot under the soft glow of streetlights. "But I hope he learned something," Sarah continued. "I hope he understands now that the people he was insulting possess real skills, real dedication, and real courage. I hope he realizes that service and sacrifice aren't abstract concepts, but concrete realities that shape people's lives and capabilities. And I hope he develops some appreciation for the fact that his comfort and security depend on the willingness of others to face dangers that he has never had to confront." Jake nodded, satisfied with Sarah's answer, even though it didn't provide the clear resolution that he had been hoping for. As he got into his car and prepared to drive home, he reflected on the broader lessons that had emerged from the evening's discussion. The incident at the charity event had become more than just a local news story or a viral video. It had become a catalyst for conversations about values and character, about the relationship between civilian society and the military, about the importance of backing up opinions with understanding and respectful debate with actual knowledge. For Sarah, those conversations represented the most important outcome of what had happened that night. The physical confrontation with Marcus had lasted less than 2 minutes, but The discussions and reflections it had sparked were ongoing, touching the lives of students, parents, community members, and anyone else who took the time to think seriously about what the incident revealed about character, courage, and the true meaning of strength. 6 months after the charity event, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would provide a different kind of closure to the entire episode. The caller identified himself as Marcus's brother, Robert Dalton, who had driven down from Chicago specifically to meet with Sarah and deliver a message that Marcus had been unable to deliver himself. They met at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, away from the places where Sarah might be recognized and where their conversation might attract unwanted attention. Robert was clearly nervous, unsure of how his message would be received, and worried about reopening wounds that might have begun to heal. "First, let me apologize for my brother's behavior," Robert began, his voice carrying genuine remorse. What he said that night was inexcusable. Our father was a Marine who served in Vietnam, and our grandfather fought in World War II. Marcus knows better. We were raised better. There's no excuse for the disrespect he showed. Sarah listened without interruption, recognizing the courage it had taken for Robert to make this trip and to speak on behalf of someone whose behavior had been so clearly wrong. "Marcus asked me to tell you that he's sorry," Robert continued, his voice growing quieter as he delivered the core of his message. "He's too proud to say it himself, too embarrassed about what happened to face you directly, but he wanted you to know that he understands now how wrong he was." Robert paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with what was clearly the most important part of his message. After he moved to Phoenix, Marcus started working with a veterans organization there, helping wounded warriors with job placement and career transition. He doesn't talk about it much, and he doesn't want any credit or recognition for it, but he's been putting in 20 hours a week for the past 3 months, just trying to do something positive. Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism at this news. The Marcus she had confronted that night had seemed completely immune to self-reflection or growth, so invested in his own superiority that admitting error appeared psychologically impossible. But perhaps the experience of having his assumptions so thoroughly disproven had created an opening for genuine change. "He also asked me to give you this," Robert said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket and sliding it across the table. "It's not much, just a donation to your dojo's scholarship program for military families." He knows it doesn't make up for what he said, but it's his way of trying to support the people he insulted. Sarah opened the envelope and found a check for $5,000 made out to the Chun Martial Arts Academy, along with a brief note written in Marcus's handwriting. "For the children of those who serve with honor. M. Dalton." The gesture was small in the context of Marcus's wealth, but significant in terms of what it represented. It suggested that somewhere beneath his arrogance and ignorance, Marcus possessed the capacity for growth and redemption that Sarah had hoped existed, but hadn't been sure she had witnessed. "I don't know if this changes anything for you," Robert concluded, "or if it makes up for the hurt he caused. But I thought you should know that what happened that night affected him more than he was able to admit at the time. He's trying to become a better person, even if he's too stubborn to do it publicly." Sarah folded the note and placed it back in the envelope, thinking about the complex dynamics of pride, shame, and redemption that Robert's message revealed. Marcus's inability to apologize directly was frustrating, but not entirely surprising, given the personality traits he had displayed during their confrontation. But his decision to channel his regret into positive action suggested that the confrontation had achieved more than she had dared to hope at the time. "Thank you for coming to tell me this," Sarah replied. "It takes courage to deliver a message like this, especially when you weren't responsible for the original problem. Please tell Marcus that I appreciate his donation and his work with veterans. That means more than any apology would." Robert nodded, clearly relieved that Sarah had received his message gracefully rather than with anger or dismissal. As he prepared to leave, Sarah asked one final question that had been on her mind throughout their conversation. "Do you think he really understands now what military service means, what those people sacrifice?" Sarah asked. "Or is this just guilt and embarrassment that will fade once people forget about what happened. Robert considered the question for a long moment before answering, clearly wanting to give Sarah an honest assessment rather than just the response he thought she wanted to hear. "I think he's beginning to understand," Robert said finally. "Working with wounded veterans has shown him things he never knew existed. The kinds of injuries people sustain, the challenges they face coming home, the support they need to rebuild their lives. He's learning that military service isn't an abstract political concept, but something that affects real people in very concrete ways." He paused, then continued with what sounded like a more personal observation. "But more than that, I think he's learning something about himself. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus is doing work that doesn't benefit him directly, that doesn't advance his career or increase his wealth or enhance his status. He's just helping people who need help because it's the right thing to do. That's not something the Marcus I knew 6 months ago would have been capable of." The conversation concluded with handshakes and mutual expressions of hope that good things could come from difficult experiences. As Robert drove back to Chicago and Sarah returned to her evening classes, both carried with them a sense that the confrontation at the charity event had achieved something more complex and meaningful than simple victory or defeat. For Sarah, the knowledge that Marcus was attempting to make amends through service rather than just words validated her decision to confront his disrespectful comments. The point hadn't been to humiliate him or to prove her own superiority, but to defend the honor of those who served and to demonstrate the reality of the training and character he had dismissed. If that demonstration had ultimately led Marcus toward a better understanding of military service and a more meaningful engagement with veterans' needs, then the confrontation had served its intended purpose. Years later, when Sarah's students asked her about the most important lessons she had learned from her martial arts training, she would often return to that night at the charity event. Not because of the physical techniques she had demonstrated or the tactical decisions she had made, but because of what the entire episode had revealed about the complex relationship between individual actions and broader consequences. A single moment of standing up for principle had rippled outward through the community, affecting conversations about respect and service, changing attitudes about military-civilian relations, and ultimately contributing to one person's journey toward better understanding and positive action. It had shown that even brief confrontations could have lasting impact, that defending values in small situations could influence larger patterns of behavior and belief. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that the true measure of martial arts training wasn't technical proficiency or competitive success, but the wisdom to know when to act and the character to act in ways that serve purposes larger than personal gratification. The physical skills were just tools. The real art lay in using those tools to defend honor, protect the vulnerable, and promote understanding between people who might otherwise never engage with each other's perspectives. As Sarah continued to teach and train, she carried these lessons forward, sharing them with new generations of students who would face their own moments of testing, their own opportunities to stand up for what they believed in, their own chances to demonstrate that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to defend principles that made communities stronger and more just. The story of that night at the charity event became part of the dojo's oral tradition, passed down from senior students to junior students as an example of how martial arts training applied to real-world situations. But more than that, it became a reminder that every person possessed the capacity to make a difference, to stand up for what was right, and to demonstrate through their actions the values they claim to hold. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that character was revealed through choices, that principles mattered only when they were defended, and that the true warriors were not those who sought out confrontation, but those who rose to meet it when the defense of honor and truth required them to act. The night Sarah faced down Marcus's disrespect had been one such moment, and it had shown everyone present what real courage looked like when it was tested by real challenge.